Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Speak Plainly podcast, where we speak plainly about things that matter. I'm your host, Owl Medicine, and in today's podcast, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite things to discuss, and that is perception deception. So, this whole episode is going to be really focused on how our perception is not really representative of reality. And when I say not really representative of reality, I mean like barely at all representative of reality. This entire podcast is really meant to just blow your mind, because I learned bits and pieces of these things as time has gone on throughout like the last decade. But I wanted to kind of concentrate all of the weird things about perception that I've learned from the human body and biology and roll it all into one episode. So that's what we're doing today. And it's all about perception deception. So the first thing we really want to talk about is, do I perceive reality as it is? Do I see what is actually happening in the world? And the answer is no. None of us do. None of us actually get to see the reality around us. We only get to see our interpretation of that reality. And we're going to dive into a few big gaps in like things that I really wish I'd have known a long time ago. We're going to talk about how faulty our memory system is. We're going to talk about how faulty our visual system is. We're going to look at illusions as demonstrations of how faulty our perceptions are. And even though our perceptions are quite faulty, we're going to be talking about why, even though they are not at all representative of the reality that we live in, they work really well for us. Which is kind of that's kind of the coolest part to me, is looking at how inaccurate our perceptions are and how useful they still remain. So, here we go. Perception deception. I want to start this whole podcast by saying there are more connections in the human brain, more synapses, is what I mean by connections between neurons. There are more synapses in the human brain than there are stars in the entire Milky Way galaxy. There are 10,000 galaxies worth of neuronal connections in your brain. Not 10,000 stars, 10,000 galaxies. That's how many connections there are in the human brain, which is an unbelievable, literally astronomical number, because that's where we get the term astronomical. There are so many neuronal connections in the brain. The first question that we really got to ask is, do I perceive reality as it is? And the answer is no. So today, we're going to look at the visual system, the pain system, illusions, and what illusions can teach us. And we're going to look at how all of this stuff affects our sense of self. This whole podcast, like I said, is about perception. That's where we have to start. So what is perception? Perception is just what I see when I look around, right? Like on the most fundamental level. And what I see when I look around is I see grass, I see trees, I see houses, I see people and cars and buildings, and somehow all of that stuff, the whole world, gets inside my head. So how do I know what gets inside of my head is the reality? How do I find that out? Well, section 1, we're going to be talking about the neuroscience and psychology of it all. We're going to look at vision and the importance of illusions and the glitches that illusions display in our perception, because the whole bottom line of like what I want you to take away from this podcast is really everything we're going to cover today is going to make you second guess reality in general. And that's kind of the point. The point is to get you to understand the way that I understand that perception is everything. You know, there was a class I took in high school that we eventually changed the name. They changed the name to FACS, or Family and Consumer Economics or something. Economic Sciences. It was home ec. That's what it was. It was home ec. And the home ec teacher at one point also taught an interpersonal relationships class. And she brought up this phrase that I'll never forget: there is no reality, only perception. And at the time in high school, I was not as deep of a thinker as I am now. But even then, there were I thought that so interesting. I found it so incredibly interesting. But there was another person in my class who was a cool guy, much more popular than me, but he brought up something that I really resonated with at the time and was like, oh, that's a very good point. And his point was, as a born-again Christian, that's not true. As a born-again Christian, there is a reality, regardless of our perception of that reality. And that reality is what guides our eternal soul to heaven or hell. Now, whether you believe it or not, I really don't give a shit. But it is very important to recognize, whether you believe that or not, that our subliminal understandings and our subconscious ways of viewing the world have deep, profound, and lasting impacts on how we exist in life. And throughout this episode, I'm going to be kind of shattering your whole concept as to like trusting your gut and trusting your own instincts and whatnot. But really, at the end of the day, we still have to trust our own illusions. And that's what we're going to find out, is that most of our perceptions are an illusion, but they're very, 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 very useful illusions. And that's good enough most of the time. Like, we learn a lot of things in science through building models, which are not the real thing. They're models of the real thing, but we still learn a lot from it. So as we move through this, don't get too upset. The end message in all of this is really, for me, about repairing old damages, letting the old bridges that may have been burned, to maybe take another look at them, because it turns out all of our perceptions are pretty screwy. So let's start with some illusions. Illusions illuminate the discrepancies between objective reality and our perceptions of reality, which are always subjective. They are, after all, only our perception of that reality. And we use illusions to understand what exactly is happening, like behind the scenes in our biology, to answer the question of how the world gets into our head. So we're going to look at a couple. We're going to look at some visual ones that you may remember. And eventually we'll look at some other audio ones. But the biggest ones we're going to talk about, we'll start with the visual system, because it's the most important to us as human beings. We are visual beings. We are visual creatures. So the first visual illusion is the Adelson checkerboard, or the checkerboard shadow illusion. And this is a podcast, so unfortunately I can't show you this illusion, but I bet you're fairly familiar with it. It's very simple. It's literally just a checkerboard with a cylinder on it. And the light source that is showing up in this illusion casts a shadow from the cylinder onto the checkerboard. And if you look at that checkerboard, you'll see a fairly congruous system of little black and white squares with a shadow cast over them. So If you're listening to this right now and you don't know what I'm talking about, Google the checker shadow illusion or checkerboard shadow illusion or the Adelson checkerboard illusion. And you're going to see a white and black checker box with part of it in shadow and part of it not. And the thing that is so confusing here is that if you look at what is not in shadow versus what is in shadow, and you look at a dark square that's not in shadow and a light square that is in shadow on this illusion, you're actually going to find out that the white and the black checkerboard checkerboard squares are the exact same color of gray. They're the exact same. So if you haven't seen it, give it a Google, look at it. Maybe you do know. But why? Why is this happening? Why is it that a black square and a white square can look exactly the same? Actually, let me scratch that. Why is it that a black square and a white square can look totally different and be the exact same? That's a much more interesting question. And the answer is that our brain is compensating. And we're going to get to how our brain compensates a little bit, but and one that you probably remember, a visual illusion that you probably remember because it was everywhere. But what happens is our brain compensates for the light source in this illusion. So if you're looking at this illusion, there's a checkerboard, there's the cylinder on the checkerboard, and there is a shadow cast along the path of the cylinder where the shadow lies. If you cover up, like use your finger, if you cover up the line where you can see how the shadow, like the edge of the shadow, that's the line I mean. If you cover up the edge of the shadow, either edge, the north edge or the south edge, then you will be able to see that a black checkerboard in the light and a white checkerboard in the gray and the shadow are the exact same color of gray. And you'll only really be able to see that after either you take a piece of cardboard or something that's the exact same color of gray to like bridge the gap, or you will notice it as soon as you cover up the edge of the shadow. And the reason that works is because your brain, my brain, is constantly compensating for the light source. So what happens is our brain is looking at this checkerboard, it's looking at the shadow, and it understands that, if there's a shadow here, that means there's a light source over there, and our brain automatically compensates for that light source. So if you put your finger over the edge of the shadow, then it kind of destroys the brain's concept for that light source. And then you go, oh, wait, they are the same color. So the big question here is, if a fully functioning brain distorts its comprehension and its perception so much to have these visual shortcuts, how accurate is our perception? And the answer is, it's not. Our perception is not accurate. We are blind to 99% of the world. Like literally 99% of the world. Right now, we are only discussing the visual system. And if you hold out your thumb way out ahead of you, like straighten your arm, lock that elbow out, and look at your thumb. Look at the thumbnail. You got it? Look at your thumbnail. If you're driving, maybe don't do this right now. But stick your arm out, lock your elbow, look at that thumbnail. You see that? That little thumbnail represents about 1 degree of your entire visual field. Now, the thing is, we experience our visual field as 2020 or 1820 or 2018 or 2027 or 2050 or whatever your visual acumen is. You experience the entire world as high def, but it's not. Because we know that if you stick your thumb out like that, you fully extend your arm and look at your thumb, that nail on the end of your thumb, it is the only part of your visual field that's actually in high def. We can only see 1% of the world in high definition at a time. And the rest of this high definition, like a feeling that we have, actually comes from our brain sampling tiny, tiny little sections of our surroundings and remembering what those tiny sampled sections kind of look like. And so we feel like we experience the whole world in HD, but we don't. We're blind basically to 99% of the world. It feels like we see it all in HD, but that's all based on models and assumptions. And models and assumptions are extremely important in neurology. They're very, very important. Something you may not know here is that eyes actually move on average of 3 times per second. The eyes are constantly darting back and forth. You know how, like, you may have seen little videos or memes of, like, how owls bob their head and, like, move their head back and forth and whatnot, and that's to help them maintain an understanding of distance because they don't actually have depth perception because of the set of their eyes. So the only way that they can actually have depth perception is to move their head around and see the tiny little variations in what moves more and what moves less. And things that move more are closer to the eyeball, and things that move less are further away. And that's how owls get depth perception. Well, we actually get our entire perception of the world through a similar thing, but it's our eyes moving about 3 times per second. And these tiny little movements are what add up. These little movements are the samplings that our eyeballs take to fill into our brain what our context and situation is. And it uses models and assumptions to fill in the gap. The models and the assumptions that we make are based on context and largely on our past experience. And we talk a lot about trauma on this podcast, and that feeds right into here. But we're gonna leave that aside now. But still, it's important to understand that the eyes really just take tiny samples in HD of our environment, and our brain fills in all of the rest. So the next question is, does that mean our world is entirely made up? And the answer is no, it's not entirely made up. It's just mostly made up. It really is just mostly made up. It is a dynamic balance of what we see, our memory, and our expectations. That is what reality is to each of us. Reality is a dynamic balance or a dance of these tiny little inputs of high quality visual information that our sight system samples one thumbnail at a time, literally. What we remember from our past, not even just consciously, but our subconscious memories from the past, and the expectations that have been set up because of our past experiences. That is our reality. Our reality is not fixed, which means no reality is fixed. Reality is made up of what we see in these tiny, tiny little high-definition samples, what our memory has stored, and the expectations that have been created because of those past experiences. And if you don't believe me, let's talk about the dress. Now, there's lots of dresses out there, but you may remember, if you're my age or maybe 10 years older, you might remember this crazy dress that showed up on social media, and then it was all over every major news station for like a year almost. There was a dress, and it had these horizontal stripes on it, and the whole world freaked the hell out because they couldn't figure out if this stripy little dress was blue and black or if it was white and gold. Now, go look at it. If you don't remember the dress, and I'm sure most of you do, if you don't remember the dress, look up the blue and black, white and gold dress, or the dress visual illusion. It wasn't even meant to be an illusion. It was just like the reality of this dress was that there was a photo taken in terrible lighting, and that terrible lighting left the dress itself in this ambiguous place in our visual systems. And that ambiguous place is what caused all of the hubbub. People were freaking out about it. People were like, if this dress isn't white and gold, my entire life's been a lie. There were probably divorces over this fucking thing because people were mad. Whole families were like, it's white and gold, it's blue and black, it's white and gold, it's blue and black. But it's the same photo. So how do all of these people, because this is about perception, how do all these people argue over the same photo? How can you look at the same photo in people who aren't colorblind? They're not colorblind. How do you look at the same photo with somebody else and neither one of you are colorblind and one of you say, no, this is 100% blue and black, and the other one says, no, it's white and gold? Because they ain't got nothing to do with each other. Blue and black and white and gold? Wow. That's very different. Like blue and white, black and gold, because that's how they had it patterned up. They're nothing alike. So how did we wind up with this argument? Well, the issue was, of course, bad lighting. What does that mean to our visual system? It means ambiguous color information. And when our brain gets ambiguous information, guess what it does? It fills in the gaps. It just fills in the gaps with what? Your expectations. According to what? Your past experiences. So, in this case, we had an ambiguous photo, or a photo of a dress with ambiguous color, at least. And so what visual scientists decided to do, including the visual scientist who now owns the dress and it sits in her closet rather than in a museum somewhere, which it probably should considering the hubbub that it stirred. But the visual scientist said, okay, everybody's arguing over it, so let me unambiguate it. And what was cool is when I listened to this lady talk about the dress and her experience with it, when she first saw it, she saw it as black and blue. And she was like, that's black and blue. But when she woke up in the morning, she saw it as white and gold. And she went, oh. And she's a color scientist. So she was like, well, clearly this is an ambiguous photo. So let me unambiguate it. So she took the dress, she slapped it into Photoshop, and she put it into highly hued backgrounds, or backgrounds with very distinct colors. And it turns out, if you do that, it unambiguates it. And certain backgrounds will make it look white and gold, but most of them will make it look blue and black, because I saw the actual dress itself in decent lighting, because she owns the dress, and it is, in fact, blue and black. Sorry about it if you're team white and gold, but team blue and black has the win on this one. So what happens is she photoshops the dress into like backgrounds that already are very clear in color. And what's so cool about this is, like, when we talk about light and we talk about color, we talk about like red light hitting, we talk about light hitting something and then reflecting green light back at us. That's actually not accurate, though. And this is what's so cool about perception, is light doesn't have color. It doesn't. Light does not have color. Grass is not green. Color is a construct. In the same way that time is a construct. In the same way that race is a construct. These are just constructs in our mind to help us navigate the world. Some are more useful than others. Color is a construct that is created in the brain, because what hits your eyeballs is not a color, it is a wavelength. And that wavelength of light hits your pupils, comes in through the pupils, that is kind of guarded by the iris that controls the constriction of the pupils to let more or less light in. And that light travels back to the back of the eye and hits all of these cones. It hits about 1.5 1.3 million cells. And of those cells, a huge chunk of those are cones, and cones do the color. And cones come in 3 basic sizes. And by sizes, I literally mean sizes, because they are literally designed to detect 3 different wavelengths of light. Because again, it's not color of light, it is wavelengths of light. And we have short, medium, and long wavelengths of light. And we have short, medium, and long cone detectors, light color detectors, which are the cones. So when light bounces off of anything, that frequency is changed. It's changed by, is it flat? It's changed by, is it textured? Is it changed by, is it wet? Is it changed by, is it dry? Is it changed by, is it cold? All of these things have some amount of effect on the wavelength of light, because as it hits, it gets reflected. And unless it is a perfectly mirror smooth surface, some amount of that wavelength is going to be interrupted, because it will be absorbed as heat by whatever the thing is, by your street sign or your mailbox. So as that light wavelength hits a thing, it then gets reflected back to us through our eyeballs, through our pupils, into the back of our retinas, absorbed by these cones in the back of our eyes that detect the 3 different wavelengths of color. And then it's not until our visual system goes all the way back to the back and then hits what's called V4 before color is ever interpreted. So there are a whole bunch of steps that all happen before color is created in the human mind. Yes, color is created in the mind. Not just the human mind. It seems like it's created in other minds as well. Why? Because color is a useful tool to navigate the world with. And we're going to keep coming back to this, because this is our first introduction into why are our perceptions just flat out fucking wrong and still somehow useful. How can something be wrong and still useful in the world? Well, guess what? That's reality. The reality around us in every way. In so many of our systems, we do not perceive reality as it is. We perceive reality as it is useful to us. That is a recurring theme. That's what we're going to keep going back to. And right now, we're only in the visual system. So maybe you remember this dress. Maybe you remember which team that you were on, because I definitely remember the dress, and I was definitely team blue and black, and I was like, whoever thinks this is white and gold is fucked up. But turns out there's a reason. We actually now know why certain people saw it as white and gold and certain people saw it as blue-black. And it has to do with your past. It has to do with your job in a lot of cases. It really has to do with where you spend the most time. Why does that matter? Should it matter? Probably not. But guess what? It does. It did in this study, because turns out people who spend their time indoors versus people who spend their time mostly outdoors had totally different interpretations of the dress, because light that is coming from the outside and light that is coming from the inside are 2 different colors. One is blue, the other is yellow. So people who spent a bunch of time inside versus people who spent a bunch of time outside saw the dress differently from each other, because indoor light is slightly more yellow and outdoor light is slightly more blue. So people who spent a lot of time outside, like a lot of time outside, saw the dress as white and gold, because they were used to having a blue hue cast on everything that they see. So their brain compensated and removed the blue from the color of the dress that they were looking at. it removed the blue hues from the photo automatically because they spend so much time in light that is naturally blue. Whereas people who saw the dress and they spent most of their time indoors, that indoor lighting, that artificial lighting, usually has a yellow tint to it. So those people, when they looked at the dress, their brains automatically compensated for the yellow hue that they're used to seeing and removed the yellow hue from the photo, unambiguating the photo in exactly the same way that putting it into Photoshop does, and they saw white and gold. So literally, this argument over white and gold or blue and black comes down to, are you indoors or outdoors more often? How much sense does that make? Like fucking none, unless you know the science, of course, which is why we're talking about it, because this is things that matter. And our perception of reality fucking matters. It matters a lot. Our perception of reality is kind of the only thing that we got, you know? So this matters a lot. And our visual system is the strongest system that we have as far as sensory systems as human beings. We are visual animals, hands down. Nothing else even comes close. Our sense of smell? No. Sense of touch? No. Sense of taste? No. All those things are good. All those things are useful. But the power of our visual system far, far outweighs the power of any other system that we have. So now the question is, why in the blue hell is our visual system so fallible? Why is it so, easily fooled? And the answer is, if it didn't work this way, the color of every single thing that you would look at would be permanently changing. Like, if we go back to before the dress and we were looking at that checkerboard illusion, what happened is, in the same way that blue or yellow light was being compensated for because of time spent indoors or time spent outdoors, the light source casting a shadow on that visual or on that checkerboard, our brain compensated for the shadow and for the light automatically to be able to keep continuity of those blocks on the checkerboard. If we didn't have that continuity, everything would be changing constantly. The color of everything that we would see would change as we moved angles. In the same way that iridescent stuff is always changing. You can't really tell what color it is because that's actually a refractory quality. And it's not a color quality, it's a refractory quality, which affects the color that you see, but it's slightly different, and there's weird science behind that I don't fully understand, so I'm not going to go into it here. But the bottom line is, if our brains did not constantly compensate for things like the hues that we normally see because of where we normally spend our time and shadow and light, everything around us, as far as the color of it, would be constantly changing, which would render color a completely useless way to navigate the world. Which would then make the world a black and white kind of place to be, which totally sucks. That is not, I don't want to live in a black and white world. Black and white is super cool in photography and stuff, but I don't want to see the world in black and white. So I'm glad that there are these weird compensations. But back to the dress. The discrepancy is because artificial light is more yellow, and those people who spent more time indoors saw it as black and blue. That was me. If you spent more time in natural light has more of a blue hue, so you saw it as white and gold. The dress is, in fact, blue and black. It is not white and gold, which means color is a construct. Color is a construct created by the mind. How often do we see that fence is red, those trees are green, that rock is white, that mailbox is gray, that road is black, or that road is gray? And we just see that it is that color. And we can agree that it's all that color because the organisms that we are typically speaking to are other human beings who have the same biology that we have, for the most part. We at least have mostly the same visual systems. So we don't have anybody to say, hey, this is different. If we could talk to dogs, we would find out that dogs see less color than we do because they're not a visually dominant species. They are a olfactory dominant species. So they see things with slightly less color and slightly less contrast than we do because they have a whole other system that can make up for it. If you look at birds see more colors than we do, especially bug-eating birds, because it's really important for a bird to be able to look at a bug and know what kind of bug it is and know that they can eat it. Because there are bugs like the Chinese blistering beetle that are hella toxic. And if you eat one of those, you're dead. So it's very important for birds to be able to see color. Bees do the same thing. They're even more advanced in the color spectrum because they need to see ultraviolet light to be able to look at a flower and see pollen and do their whole pollen thing. So this is our visual system. It is totally fallible, and it is our strongest system. Now we're going to move on to audio illusions. And I wanted to have a recording of this, but they've taken all of them down, so I wasn't able to do this without copyright infringement because it's been a whole thing. But you might remember Yanny versus Laurel, where they did this whole thing of where there was an ambiguous audio signal in the same way that the dress was an ambiguous color signal, and people either heard Yanny or they heard Laurel. There was another one where people heard either the word brainstorm or the word green needle. And if you haven't heard these, go listen to them because you're not going to believe it unless you go do these illusions. That's why they're illusions, right? Because these illusions show us the cracks in our own matrix. The illusions that we find in the world show us how fallible and weird and twisted our sense of perception it really is. So when you look at these listen to these audio illusions, brainstorm versus green needle, what happens is with the brainstorm and green needle, it's the exact same audio clip, but if you look at the words brainstorm, you will hear brainstorm. And if you look at the word green needle, you will hear green needle, even though the audio clip is absolutely identical. And if you do the Yanny versus Laurel thing, same thing, but rather than the cue being visual in the way like you can read brainstorm or read green needle, the way that they separated Yanny and Laurel is, it turns out, certain people have a higher tendency of listening to high frequency sounds, and other people have more of a tendency to listen to low frequency sounds. And maybe that has to do with threat perception and that sort of thing. But if you filter out the high frequencies of the audio clip in this Laurel Yanny thing, if you filter out the high frequencies, you'll hear the word Laurel. If you isolate and remove the low frequencies of the same audio clip, then you very clearly hear the word Yanny. And this is interesting to me as a vocalist because like law, aw, o, like oral, because those are the sounds, and Laurel is laurel. You got aw, o. Those are very open, kind of deep sounding sounds, whereas Yanny, those those are higher frequencies. Sorry if that was loud and annoying or whatever, but those we know through, especially opera singers, they have a whole like circle of fifths thing where they're like, okay, well, if you need to do this sound, an E sound at a high B flat, then you actually need to go like an eighth of a note higher in order for that E sound to really come out sounding at the frequency that you want it to be at to make you sound on pitch, because the sound, the shape of the note, as we call it as vocalists, the shape of a vowel dramatically changes the frequency that actually comes out. So we're constantly doing this subconscious like balancing act between what sound we're making with our mouth and what frequency is actually coming out. Because if you filter out the high stuff, you hear laurel, and if you filter out the low stuff, only leaving the high, you hear yanny, because yanny is a higher frequency sound than laurel. You could probably even hear that yanny, laurel, yanny. Even if I go same pitch, laurel, yanny, laurel. You can hear it's slightly higher or slightly lower. And so people who have a tendency to listen to high frequency or low frequency sounds wind up hearing one or the other. So what I'm getting at, and that's the audio system. I was going to try to play them for you. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to do that, but give it a listen. The bottom line, though, of all of these is ambiguous info is interpreted automatically and convincingly by our expectations of the world, both audio and visual. That's the bottom line. Ambiguous information. And since our strongest sense is visual, and our visual world is created by one tiny degree of our huge field of vision, we can only see 1 degree of that in high def at any given moment. Turns out that almost all information is ambiguous information unless you are hyper-focused and fixated on it. And so the bottom line of all of this is that the world is very, very real. Reality is there. It is there outside of us. But the problem is, you and I, we ain't never lived there. We ain't never lived in reality. We've lived in our heads. We've lived in our minds. And somehow the external world makes its way into our minds and into our body. And how does it do that? Well, we've talked about the visual system and we've talked about the audio system. But now we're going to go toward the touch system, and we're going to talk about pain perception, because this was brand new to me, and this was really effing cool. So this pain perception study I'm talking about is from this PhD lady named Theanne Griffin at UC Davis, and she decided to build an exercise where they put a series of metal bars all right next to each other, alternating warm, cold, warm, cold. And what happens is, when they start you off, you touch one and you're like, oh, that's warm. And you touch the one next to it. You can touch the first one and you're like, oh, that's warm. And then you touch the one above that, and then that's cold. The one above that is warm. The one above that is cold again. None of these are hot or cold enough to cause damage. You're not going to get frostbite, and you're not going to get third-degree burns or even first-degree burns from these tubes. They're just warm and cold. That's it. Hot and cold tubes all right next to each other. And when you touch one at a time, no issues. But when you put your whole hand on a row of about 16 of these in a row, it causes pain. So they she's doing studies where they're having people put their hand on this row of metal tubes, and they're going, ow, and pulling their hand back, even though neither the cold nor the hot is at enough of a degree to actually cause physical pain. So what in the hell is happening here? Well, the science here, because the people who built this, even Theanne Griffith at UC Davis, is well, we don't really know what's happening. It's kind of confusing. But if you talk to a neuroscientist, they'll tell you exactly what they think is happening. And what they say is, we have sensors in our body for cold, for heat, and for pain. 3 different sensors. Right? So we have nociception is the sensors for pain, and they gave weird Latin names for cold and heat. I forget what they are, Freya something and whatever. But we have cold sensors, which are separate from heat sensors, which are separate from pain sensors in our body, which are also separate from pressure sensors, which are separate from tickling sensors. Those are all different sensors. We really just have 5 main sensors in our body, unique tiny little organelles in our body and all these different places in our body that are designed to detect certain things. And here we have cold, heat, and pain. That's what we're focusing on now. The issue with this study is, because the cold and the heat are right next to each other, they cancel each other out because they're about the same level of cold as they are the same level of heat. But when you feel cold, you also stimulate pain receptors. And what normally happens is the same thing that happens when you feel heat. You also feel little pain receptors. But you're like, okay, well, here's some cold, here is some heat, and usually you're only dealing with one at a time. So you're like, all right, here's some cold, and there's some pain with there. But the cold tells your brain to override the pain, and it's like, it's not pain, it's actually just cold. And you're like, cool. Well, in this situation, the cold and the pain cancel each other out, and the only signal getting to your brain is pain. Which tells you that not only is time a construct, and race is a construct, and color is a construct, guess what? Pain is a goddamn construct too. Pain is a construct. How crazy is that? Now, I'm not saying pain is not real. Pain is very real. And if you want to get scientific about it, what we're really talking about noxious stimuli. Noxious stimuli is very real. Cold to a certain level or heat to a certain level is a noxious stimuli. That's very real. But whether your body interprets it as pain or not is totally individual. That is a construct. To such a degree that there are actually people who are born with genetic mutations of certain proteins and certain genes that code for proteins, and those genes and those mutations prevent them from actually feeling pain. And these are kids that chew their nails until they bleed. They're kids that bite their lips until they bleed, and they don't actually realize that they're doing these things. And I know that sounds crazy, and that's why I decided to go and look up the actual gene stuff for this, because I was looking for a weird name because I assumed that there was a weird name for this diagnosis. They really just call it CIP. That's the diagnosis, which is congenital immunity to pain. And it is mutations in the SCN9A and SCN11A that cause painlessness, while another mutation of the same gene causes episodic neuropathic pain, which I love because I love genes, and I love how we used to have they called it the Jennifer Aniston gene. There was this whole thing for a while about how this gene means this for the body, and this gene, if you have this gene, it means this about you. And now we know that that's all bullshit. It all has to do with if you have this gene activated and it gets stimulated in your environment in a certain way, you will have this reaction. It's always about the gene is there, but it needs activated by the environment. And here, this mutation is no different. One mutation makes it to where people cannot feel pain. They're just not feeling pain. They're congenitally immune to such pain, whereas a different mutation of the exact same genes, that SCNA or SCN9A and SCN11A, causes them to be in pain. They have episodic neuropathic pain. There are other ones as well. I decided to keep looking because I was like, surely there's more than one, and there is. And in 2019, they also found out an FAAH out gene is what they call it, and that gene does the same thing with a mutation, causes zero pain, as well as the NTRK1, which causes chronic pain. And that one was found in 2011 along with the HCN2 gene with mutations. So I just listed 5 different genes that all lead to either chronic pain or no pain at all. Just depends on your life experiences. The same gene, slightly different mutations, cause us to either experience no pain or experience too much pain. And the big problem is if you don't experience any pain, then you're not going to learn much. Because pain is very important for learning. As children, we're constantly doing things that cause us pain, and that is how we navigate the world. That's how we learn, oh, don't do that because that hurts. Pain is very important for perception, and pain is very important for learning. And I really wanted to cover this today because I love illusions. I love our sense of perception. Illusions help us see that the way that we perceive things may not be the way that they are. Illusions in the brain shows us the shortcuts that our brain takes so we can navigate the world. Because the bottom line of all of this is, like, the takeaway from this episode is we don't navigate the world accurately. None of us. None of us. No matter how smart or accurate you think you are, myself included, because I think I'm a quick, smart, accurate guy. I try to be anyway. And I'm wrong. Like, it's just that's the bottom line of all of it. And I'm wrong more often than I'm not, because that's the way that our biology works. That's the way that perception works. Illusions show us what shortcuts our brain takes. And for the brain, it seems like the best way to ensure survival would be to multiply that system, to then provide us with redundancy of not what is accurate, but what is useful. That's what we need to understand about our perception, is we find what is useful to us. Full stop. And if you haven't listened to the reticular activating system episode, the RAS episode, go back and listen to that, because that really, that combined with this is a very, very, very powerful combo. That's a 1-2 punch from hell. So, like, the world that you expect to see is the world that you will see 100%, because we only see 1% of our visual field accurately in high def, even though that we think we constantly see almost everything in high def, but we don't. And the way that we've been able to learn all of these things about perception is because of some very unfortunate folks. We've had people who have had things like strokes, and we have learned a lot through these stroke victims. We've learned about a whole thing called blind vision. So in blind vision, they have studied many people, but I specifically looked at the case of this one lady who had a stroke, and she had a stroke in the visual part of her brain. And to study what was happening with her, they hooked her up to a system to help calibrate her eyes to make sure she was looking at the same spot the entire time. The way that they studied this stroke lady, and we learned about blind vision, is actually the first time that we ever saw perception and consciousness are separate. Like, what you are conscious of and what you perceive are two separate things. Don't believe me? Check out blind vision. So they took this stroke lady. She had a stroke in the visual portions of her brain. She was not able to see this certain spot in her vision. And that certain spot made it to where, as she was driving, there would be oncoming cars that would just disappear into her blind spot, which is anxiety producing, to say the least. So she went in to try to get all this looked at. She actually went in for a migraine and for a headache because she was having this hella headache and realized she was having this blind spot. And then they told her, oh, you had a stroke. So they decided to look at all of her stuff, and they put her onto this machine. They do the study where they calibrate this machine to her eyes. They use this special software program to make sure that her eyes don't drift. And her job, while she's hooked up to this machine, is to look at one dot on a screen. And at that one dot on the screen, there's a little circle with little dots inside that one, inside the circle, where she has to say, is that the circle with the dots inside of it to the left of her focal point, the other dot on the screen? Is it to the left of her focal point, or is it to the right of her focal point? And what was very interesting is she was able to say right or left or right or left and guess right most of the time. And what was really, really, really interesting is then they upped the ante a little bit with the same type of test. And they triangulated exactly where her blind spot was. And they took little tools, like there was literally like a tiny wrench and a tiny screwdriver and a tiny hammer. And they had all these cute little miniaturized tools. And they took a miniaturized tool and they put it exactly in her blind spot and said, what do you see? And she would say, nothing. And they would go, okay. And then they would give her a couple options to choose from. Like, choose what you think was in your blind spot. And although she saw nothing consciously, she chose correctly almost every single time. the overwhelming majority, she was correct. She had well above chance to guess which tool was in her blind spot, which is mind-boggling because that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that our conscious perception and perception are two different things, that they are separate and distinct, that you cannot register something consciously and it will still affect your behavior and choices. I'm going to say that again. I'm going to say that one more time for y'all. This study, blind vision, look up blind vision. These studies, because there's been a bunch of them, it's not just one stroke related. There's been lots of folks who had strokes in visual portions of their eye, and they've done similar studies in different parts, but it's very obvious in this visual portion of the brain. They put a tool in the blind spot of this lady and said, "What do you see?" She said nothing, and then said, "Guess what was in your blind spot?" And she was right every time. That is proof that what we consciously register and what we subconsciously register both affect our behavior. Because she saw nothing, yet she chose correctly, well above chance. If she were just guessing, she would have gotten it wrong way more than she did, but she wasn't, which means something was getting in. Below conscious perception, something was getting in. She was able to see the screwdriver when she couldn't actually see consciously the screwdriver, which is that's crazy. It proves that perception and consciousness are separate, which it shows that we can use visual information without conscious perception of that visual information. And we know that to some degree now because we have spent we've spent time covering polyvagal theory and looking at neuroception. Because that's kind of that is the process of neuroception, is things that are not consciously registered are still profoundly impactful in many cases. That whole process is neuroceptive. And so now I'm going to move quickly into the child's brain versus the adult brain. So in a toddler, at 2 years old, a toddler has about 2 quadrillion synapses. So looking at a toddler's brain versus an adult brain, a toddler at 2 years old has about 2 quadrillion synapses. As an adult, we have half of that. Now, 1 quadrillion synapses is still a lot of synapses. But when you think about how much a quadrillion is, you think about million versus billion, which is an obscene difference. I know it doesn't seem like that, but there's the whole 37 weeks or whatever. I don't even remember what that statistic is, but Google the statistic of time when you compare million to billion, and it will blow your mind. And you'll be like, fuck all billionaires. But here, we have an even more dramatic, going up to quadrillion. So we remove half of that, and you have 1 quadrillion rather than 2 quadrillion synapses in an adult brain. But what does that really mean? That means that the adult brain is much more like a superhighway as opposed to the toddler brain being like a bunch of old country roads. The country roads are all potential. They go to 1 million places and have basically infinite possibilities. But it is powerfully inefficient. And if you don't believe me, just try getting your toddler ready to have them put a jacket on so you can go somewhere and see how incredibly inefficient their brain is. Now, they can't seem to put a jacket on, but they could learn Swahili with no accent, and that's great. That's easy. But putting a jacket on and getting outside so you can make it to the doctor's appointment in time, nearly impossible. Why? Because they don't have the adult brain that has pruned away all of these random little country roads that hadn't gotten used. Because over time, we don't use them, and if you don't use it, you lose it. That's biology. So it trims it all away, and the adult brain becomes a lean, efficient machine, like a superhighway, going to a handful of places very quickly, but not so good at going to other places. And which makes our consciousness as a child versus the consciousness that we have as an adult be more like a floodlight. As a toddler, we can be conscious of 1 million things all at once, whereas an adult, our consciousness, our attention is really much more like a spotlight. The last system I want to talk about here is memory. We are a collection of our memories. And this is some of the most damning information I ever got, which I really didn't like at first, but became kind of part and parcel for the whole way that I view the world now. It turns out memory is incredibly fallible because memory is dynamic, and we are constantly living a revision of our lives. And I mean that literally. I used to think, because we all used to think, that memory was static, that you reached back into the recesses of your brain and you dusted off this little memory and you pull it out, just like you pull out an old trinket out of a box in the attic and you look at it and you go, wasn't that fun? And then you put it back away and you can pull it out again later and it'll be the same. Turns out that's bullshit. Because it turns out that every time that you recall a memory, you destroy that long-term memory. And the only way for it to go back into long-term memory is to recast it into long-term memory, which means it is an active memory in the moment, and that memory becomes unstable. All recalled memories are unstable memories, and it is only after we recast them into long-term memory that they can become long-term memory again. So essentially, it's like going online and uploading a picture of this amazing time that you had, and then saving it from Facebook onto your phone, and then sending it to a friend, and them saving it onto their phone, and then them sending it back to you, and you saving it onto yours, and you sending it to another friend, and every single time it gets saved, it adds more noise to the photo. And that's an actual photography term if you don't know the term noise, but it is a literal thing where that causes, it's a type of falseness of the memory. Every time you recall a memory, it becomes more and more and more false. And there was a guy who won a Nobel Prize for being the first one to figure out that when there are long-term memories stored, it literally creates new synapses in the brain. And when we recall that, he won a Nobel Prize for that there is literally a new synapse created for each long-term memory that is stored. And turns out when we recall that, it's destroyed, which is kind of crazy. That's kind of super, super duper mind-boggling. But for us on this podcast and us chronic stress adapted folks, that's kind of amazing. Because even though every time that we recall a memory, it adds more noise to the signal, and each recall makes that memory more false and less accurate, for those of us with trauma, that's perfect. If it wasn't for that system, we could never, ever, ever heal from our trauma, because no matter how many times we pulled it out and looked at it, it would stay the same. I hope that's clear. I hope that hits you like it hit me. If our memory recall was static in the way that I used to think that it was static, we would never be able to heal from our past. This is exactly why this is exactly why we say that you should only tell your story to people who have earned the right to hear it. Because when you recall that memory becomes unstable. So if you recall a damaging memory and the person that you're telling this story to adds more damage to it, you start to feel some type of way because of the way that they reacted to it, that memory becomes worse. The noise that is created is not white noise. It is negative noise. It is very much an issue. We've got to deal with it. So when we tell our story to people who have earned the right to hear it, part of what happens is those people don't respond in damaging ways. They don't respond to us with judgment. They don't respond to us with fear, with agitation, with whatever it is that's going to make it worse, but respond to us with compassion. So every time we recall that memory, the noise that is added is a noise of compassion. And over time, that compassionate noise changes that memory, and it goes from being a traumatic memory to a terrible story being made boring. And that's how you know you've healed. That's how you know you've healed from your traumatic event. When you can make a terrible story boring when you tell it, that's healing. So I know it feels kind of fucked that our memory is so beyond fallible. Fallible isn't strong enough of a word. A joke is a bit better of a word. But man, if we didn't have it this way, we could never heal. There's always wisdom in our biology. There's always wisdom in our flesh. We just need to find it. We just need to find it. I hope this podcast was interesting for you. I really enjoyed this one. I'm headed out into the woods. I'm not going to be able to do one next week. I was trying to do this one last week, but I spent about 8 hours just creating this outline and doing research and all of that. So it is what it is, but now it's done. Now you get to hear it. This is perception deception. Our perceptions of the world are not to be trusted. Not at all. Our visual system cannot be trusted. Our audio system cannot be trusted because ambiguous information, which, as we learned today, is pretty much all information. Most things are fairly ambiguous to one degree or another. Any kind of ambiguous information is then interpreted primarily by our past and the expectations that have been created because of our past experiences. So any kind of ambiguous information is really going to be projected upon by us and our nervous system, and we are going to see what we expect to see. That's the bottom line of our perception. We see what we expect to see. So what do you expect? What do you expect from yourself? What do you expect from your spouse? What do you expect from your job? What do you expect from the world around you? And what do you expect from yourself? Because what you expect is what you'll see. That's the big takeaway. Perception deception. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you very, very, very much for hanging out. I really, really like this episode. This is a subject that is near and dear to my heart, and I think is a very important thing for everybody to know. So, thanks again for hanging out with me. Thanks again for listening. If you like the podcast, consider supporting, consider becoming a Patreon or doing the whole buy me a coffee thing. Definitely try to leave me a review if you can. I would really appreciate that. Maybe send it to somebody you know or tell somebody you know about it. I appreciate you listening, and I appreciate you spending your time with me. Thank you very, very much from the bottom of my heart. And remember, stay curious and stay uncomfortable.